All right. I got to admit, I'm kind of excited that this is my last night of teaching Christian ethics. I love the topic, but it is an intense one for the study on my part. It's also intense because you never know what questions you're going to get each night. And I appreciate your participation and your willingness to pose challenging questions. And hopefully I've done okay, at least, at responding to those. I know there's been some I've missed throughout the year and never gotten around to, and I apologize for that. But tonight will be our concluding lesson. And just by way of overview, we are currently focused on financial ethics. We're referring to it as a financial stewardship ethic. And you may recall that when we began this segment, this section, we defined what a steward is. A steward is a person who manages another's property or financial affairs. In other words, a steward is someone who does not own what he or she has, but has been entrusted with it by the owner to use it wisely. And so we have focused particularly on the handful of lessons we've done in financial ethics. We've focused primarily on what wise stewardship entails, what the Bible outlines as proper stewardship. And we noted a few things. We noted that the Bible prohibits greed. And so therefore our stewardship ethic must not include any financial practices that involve greed of any sort. This may apply to our benevolence towards other people. This may apply towards our first fruits mentality towards the Lord. But greed is prohibited. The Bible also prohibits laziness, and so when it comes to our financial ethic, there must be an accompanying work ethic that we're going to, be industrious and contribute so that we are able to provide. And this particularly flies in or particularly coordinates with Paul's statement in 2 Thessalonians that if you do not work, you do not eat, that sort of thing. And we've also noted that a proper financial ethic based on the Bible is one that is not practicing things that are unrighteous. Now, we've got a little more specific on what unrighteous financial practices might include. They might include inconsiderate gain or dishonest gain or oppressive gain. And if you missed any of these lessons and want to go back and listen and catch up, they are all online. But from there, I decided that there were going to be two main financial ethic issues or subjects that needed us to focus on. One was gambling, and we covered that a couple of weeks ago. We addressed gambling because it's one of those financial subjects around which there tends to be the most ethical controversy. And the other one we're going to address tonight, and that is debt. Debt is another one of those financial subjects that can be controversial, particularly based on what you read in Scripture. And so we want to spend the first part of our time tonight asking the question, what does the Bible say about debt, about borrowing money? Now, I want to start with this. The Bible has no problems with the practice of borrowing, per se. And we have no problem with the practice of borrowing. How many of you have ever checked out a book from a library? Raise your hand. You know that's becoming like a lost art? We had this discussion in my home just this week. My mother-in-law, she'll go to the library just about every week or every other week, check out a book, and she's an avid reader, and she decided it's because we share a house, it's easier to check it out than to store it in the house. But my Micah, she's disgusted by the idea of checking out a library book. She's done it, but she would rather own it. And we were having a discussion with her about, check it out. Go check it out because you may not read it again. You may choose not to read it again. So why buy it? But she wants to purchase. She wants to have them on her bookshelf. Anyway, the idea of library. Sorry, that was me getting off track as I do too often in teaching. The idea of borrowing, we're okay with in terms of like a library. We're okay with it in terms of like renting a car when we're traveling. You're borrowing somebody else's car in that process. We're okay with that. Where we sometimes get uncomfortable is in the realm of borrowing money. Because when you're checking out a book at the library, you only have to pay, there's only an expense if you fail to return it or you damage it. If you're renting a car, you're paying for that privilege up front, so there's not necessarily any back-end cost unless you damage the car or something of that nature, or you don't return it on time. When it comes to debt, what we're dealing with is borrowing money and paying for it later, and I think that's where we get uncomfortable with it, because A, there's going to be interest charged on that borrowing, and B, all too often we encounter people who fail to fulfill their obligations with it, or who abuse that opportunity to the point of creating massive amounts of debt. So there's issues that we recognize. Really what we want to consider tonight is this: not if incurring debt is an appropriate practice, but whether or not it's a biblical practice. Because I'm going to come back to that, because we have a passage like this, Romans chapter 13, verse 7 and 8. This is what Paul says. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. Owe no one anything. At first glance, what is your conclusion about debt based on this verse? That you shouldn't have any. The New International Version actually quotes verse 8 as saying, let no debt remain outstanding. And if you just looked at this verse face value, it's going to be easy to conclude that we should never be in debt. Here's my question. I'm surrounded by a bunch of Christians right now. How many of you have or ever have had a mortgage? Raise your hand. Ooh, so I'm surrounded by a bunch of sinners. If we're not supposed to have any debt, we're all a bunch of sinners because we had a mortgage. So does this literally mean you should never have any debt at any time? That's the question. Who wants to answer that question? Oh, y'all just want me to? What I want you to notice in particular with Romans 13, I have to admit something. I've kind of changed my view of this. Years ago, Sarah and I took Financial Peace University with Dave Ramsey. If you go through that course, Dave Ramsey is anti-debt. And he has biblical principles that he applies to his strategy and his belief. And listen, I like the way, particularly that aspect of what is taught in that financial program. I like it. I support it. The whole debt snowball policy and staying out of debt, man, fantastic. It saved mine and Sarah's lives because we had accrued too much credit card debt at a point in life. We weren't financially responsible in our early years. And we entered that program. We got out of that debt because we applied those policies. And after taking that course, and I've taken it 3 times now, after taking that course, I came to the conclusion that the Bible is anti-debt. But as I've spent more and more time examining this, because primarily of the mortgage concept that we all have, I mean, the very few of us are capable of paying cash outright for a house, especially in the markets we're in these days. So that always made me feel like, okay, if I believe that having debt is wrong, then why am I okay having a mortgage? I felt hypocritical, to be honest. But I think when you read this passage in Romans chapter 13, it stood out to me that verse 7, which is leading up to verse 8, doesn't just talk about what you owe financially. It talks about what you owe relationally. Paul's point isn't so much, hey, never incur debt, it's always pay your debts. I want you to think about this in a broader landscape. As long as the debt is repaid at the time it's been promised to be repaid, are you fulfilling the obligation of Romans chapter 13, verse 8? If there's a couple of other passages that come to mind, particularly in James, when we're told to let our yes be yes and our no be no. If you enter into a contractual obligation with a mortgage company for your house, and you agree that I will pay X amount on this day every month over the next 15 years or 20 years or 30 years or whatever it is, as long as you're paying on time, the full amount on time, you're not letting a debt remain outstanding. The agreed upon debt for that month at that time, you've paid. You are not letting the debt remain outstanding. If you are refusing or failing to pay those agreed upon debts, then now you're getting into a controversial area. But if you are paying that, you're fulfilling your temporary obligation each time you pay it. I think that is a more appropriate way to interpret what Paul is trying to get across. Let no debt remain outstanding, meaning if you have an obligation, whether it's financially or relationally or whatever it is, take care of it. And that may mean that you're taking care of it every month over the next 20, 30 years, but as long as you're not letting it remain outstanding until the next time it's due, then guess what? You're fulfilling your obligation. That's my understanding based on having studied this a bit further. Now, with that being said, my point is that I don't think the Bible condemns all forms of indebtedness. In fact, I skipped over this a moment ago. I think about the parable of the talents. In Matthew chapter 25, it's a lengthy passage, and I got a lot to cover, so I'm not going to read it in its entirety. But if you're unfamiliar with the parable of the talents, it basically boils down to this. Jesus tells this parable as a comparison to the kingdom of God. And he says there's a master who has 3 servants, and he gives some financial resources to each of the 3 servants. He gives 5 coins to one servant. He gives 2 coins to another servant, and he gives 1 coin to a third. They don't get equal amounts, but they all get something. And it's very evident through the parable that they're expected to take the money he has given them and use it to further his estate, for lack of a better word, to increase his estate. The whole concept of the parable is speaking to this idea of stewardship. Are you using what's been given to you wisely and beneficially for the one who owns it, or are you squandering it? Now, the parable, according to the parable, the servant who receives 5 coins and the servant who receives 2 coins, they go out and double the investment given to them. And when the master returns, they take and give back what they have in total, and the master praises them. Where it gets interesting to me is with the one talent, the guy that has 1 coin. Why it's interesting to me is because of the excuse he gives for not growing the sum of money that was given to him. He says to the master, I knew you were a hard man. I knew you gather where you have not planted, and because of that, I went and hid it in the ground. Here's what was yours. Take it back. In other words, all the servants realized that they've been given some sum of money that's expected to be repaid. There is a sense in which you can look at that and go, even though the servants didn't necessarily ask for it, they are being given money borrowed. And you could imply that there is a sense in which interest is expected to be returned on that investment. The 5-talent servant, he's not charged the interest, but he gives 5 talents more in return. Same with the 2-talent servant. He doubles it. The one talent servant, what's the critique that the master gives him? Well, instead of burying it, you should have put it in the bank. At least it would have gained interest, and then that would have been mine. There was an expectation that what was given would be returned with more. There is an element, and I'm not saying that this was a banking scenario of where, hey, you're borrowing money from the bank and now you've got to pay it back with interest. But notice there is an element in which there is money lent through entrustment, if that's a word. I may have just made it up, and I like making up words. There is this lending of money with an expectation that it will be repaid with more. So I don't think the Bible is anti-debt, but the Bible is filled with warnings about debt. For instance, let me make sure I'm not. Before I get into those warnings, let me point out, really what I think it comes down to is debt is about whether or not it involves wise financial stewardship practices. I think there are some debts that fall in the category of this is wise stewardship. For instance, I took out a student loan to get the education I did. Reason being, if you want to get a Bible degree, if you want to get a Bible degree, particularly in Churches of Christ, you're not going to state school for that. You have to go to private school. For the career I wanted to pursue, I had limited options for the education I needed. And so I chose to go to a Christian college that was going to require, that there's no way I was going to be able to pay for up front. Not when it's $20,000 a semester. So I took out student loans. I have since paid those back. I have no regrets. I believe it was an investment in my future that allowed for me to have the income that I needed to repay that debt. I never missed a repayment, always on time, no regrets. I believe a mortgage falls in that category. That in our society and culture, and in our economic system, it is nearly impossible to own your own property without going via mortgage at some point in time. Now, I think there's a point in your life where you're able to get out of that, not just by paying it off, but there's points in life where you have accrued enough financial stability that you can pay off your mortgage, or you can sell that property and purchase something that is more financially appropriate for you, or whatever it is. But I think mortgages are not a bad investment. In fact, if you read Dave Ramsey's book on financial peace, he will tell you that the best debt is that in which involves a mortgage with appropriate terms, because you're investing in something that is increasing in value typically. And because of the process of gaining equity and things like that, you're actually investing in something that is gaining value. He says, as opposed to like a car loan, you're investing in something that's always losing value. So I think that's an appropriate debt. I also think probably if you have to take out a loan because of your own misfortune in terms of I'll get you. In terms of, let me find it in my notes again. You face a personal accident or a severe illness or some sort of circumstance that has set you back from being able to earn income. Like, I think those can be appropriate at times too. What I think we have to be wary of is any kind of incurred debt that exists because of our covetousness or our discontent. Just to reference these couple of passages, Ephesians 5 condemns being covetous, as does the Ten Commandments for that matter. And then Hebrews chapter 13:5 condemns being discontent. And oftentimes our accruement of credit card debt or our accruement of certain loans, maybe in the realm of a car loan or I'm going blank, but there are certain debts that may fit in the category where it has more to do with us being covetous or discontent than it does about us having needs or investing in something that is beneficial for the future, that sort of thing. So I think there are some wise steward practices that involve debt, and there are some poor steward practices that involve debt. And let me pause there. Kurt. Yeah. Well, technically, it never condemns loaning, it condemns charging interest. Loaning was appropriate and expected, but charging interest was the issue. And that you weren't supposed to charge interest for your fellow brother, but you could charge interest for the foreigner that's among you. And I believe that's because the foreigner might up and leave, and therefore you no longer have access to getting paid back. Whereas your brother, the reason you're typically loaning to your brother is because they're in an impoverished situation or they're in a difficult situation, and instead of trying to make profit off of them, help them. That's the concept that kind of generally follows Mosaic law. But thank you for bringing that up. It does show that the aspect of borrowing money is not wrong in and of itself. There might be times where where the reason you're doing it or the way you're doing it is a problem, but the general idea. Yeah, yeah. Cookie. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 And we all felt the consequences of that in 2008. Rich. Take a trip. Yeah. Yeah. And something else to throw in there, not just are we comfortable with debt and using it for, but where in there does the debt start preventing us from doing things for the kingdom, for God, that sort of thing. So that great thoughts. Thank you for sharing. But let me get to this now. So the Bible may not. I don't think personally don't believe the Bible is condemning all debt, but the Bible is very serious about warning us of the danger of debt. So we can go to a few different passages. I'll start with Mosaic law. In Exodus chapter 22 and verse 14, this was an instruction given to the Israelites. If a man borrows anything of his neighbor and it is injured or dies, the owner not being with it, he shall make full restitution. The next verse says if the owner was present, restitution is not necessary. But here's the warning. You're borrowing. So this involves something that does relate to debt. If you're borrowing something, you're using it temporarily and you're responsible for it until it's returned to its original owner. No matter what that is, whether you're borrowing an animal or borrowing a tool or borrowing money. And if something happens to it, you're responsible for it. So the point being that there is an inherent risk when you're involving yourself in borrowing on any level. Also, Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 7, which has kind of already been alluded to or referenced in something Cookie said a moment ago. You have Proverbs 22 verse 7, which says, the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is the slave of the lender. What's the point that Solomon is making here is that as long as you have debt, it is a master over you because your future freedom financially is tied to it. You can't do other things with your finances, whether it be for the benefit of you and your family or for the benefit of God, because you have to pay that. And so you are enslaved to the one who holds the debt financially because you have the responsibility of paying that. Another passage is Psalm chapter 37, verse 21, where it says, the wicked borrows but does not pay back, but the righteous is generous and gives. And underlying this particular psalm is the recognition that some aren't going to pay their debts back. And this is a warning against borrowing beyond your ability to repay, because categorically the one who borrows and doesn't pay is considered in the eyes of the psalmist as wicked. So 3 different warnings for different reasons against debt. While the Bible may not condemn it, it definitely says that you need to be careful with it. There is caution given because there are risks involved. Let me kind of conclude this concept regarding debt with this. When it comes to the subject of indebtedness, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that Paul's teaching on giving acknowledges that we're expected to give according to our means. When you go study giving in the Bible, Paul calls on us to give according to our means and above our means when we can. But you're not expected to give more than your means. If I'm not expected to give more than my means, then I think it goes to say that I'm not expected to live above my means either. And so when it comes to debt, we need to apply that principle. I don't have to give God more than my means allow, but I shouldn't be living above what my means allow at the same time. I think that's a good basic principle when it comes to debt. That's all I wanted to study on debt tonight. Does anybody have any other questions, particularly on this subject, before I make a little transition? Or what was that, Jim? I cannot speak to bankruptcy. I'm not intelligent enough in that arena to know how it all works or when it is you file for it or how the process works thereafter. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how somebody files for bankruptcy and then becomes a billionaire again. Like, that blows my mind. But anyway, so I can't really speak to that. But I am a believer in paying your debts. Regardless of how that has to be done, I'm a believer that if you owe it, you need to pay it back. That's the extent of what I can say on that matter. Ms. Carolyn. In Romans 13? What does it say? no man anything. So the primary difference you're noticing is by saying one man, it takes it away from a corporation. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a fair observation. Cookie, you got something to add? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, just for the online audience, I know I haven't been spouting off everything everybody's been saying because it's a lot, but Cookie's explaining bankruptcy. And that brings up a great point that has been a part of our study of ethics this whole time. There is often a difference between what is legally ethical and what is biblically ethical. And so just because the law allows something doesn't mean our conscience should. And so we need to recognize that. I know that's like we're at the last class of the ethical series. We should have been talking about that a lot more. But that's the idea of this, is our ethic is based on Scripture. And so just because something is legal, ethically acceptable in our country, doesn't mean it's ethically acceptable to Christ. That's the difference that we need to recognize. And I think that's the difference Ms. Cookie's trying to point out, is that by a court of law, you can file bankruptcy and have your debts excused for these reasons, but does that justify it from a Christian perspective? So, great observation. With that being said, I want to have some concluding thoughts on financial ethics. And I want to do so by talking about some guardrails. Now, some of you all have heard me talk about guardrails before, how, guardrail when you're on the road is a device, an instrument that exists to help protect you from a danger. If you're driving and you see a guardrail, that guardrail is there because there might be a ravine below, there might be a river, there might be some sort of other object or dangerous situation on the other side of it, that if you were to cross that, you would be endangering yourself. So a guardrail is a protective system installed near hazardous areas in order to warn drivers of potential dangers and or prevent drivers from encountering those dangers. Now, we understand that when we're driving. What we need to understand is that spiritual guardrails should exist in our lives as well. We need to set up spiritual guardrails that will prevent us from crossing over into dangerous terrain. A spiritual guardrail, and I got this definition from another preacher who this whole concept I borrowed from. A spiritual guardrail is a personal standard of conduct that, when violated, harms one's conscience and thereby warns the individual that he or she is venturing into sinful territory. So to make that simple, it's a policy you put in place in your life that if I ever cross this line, I'm going to recognize that I need to stop moving in that direction. It's protective intentionally. So, to give you an example of a guardrail, if you go back to the book of Genesis, what was the one rule Adam and Eve had in the Garden of Eden? Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. When the serpent tempted Eve with eating of that fruit, what was Eve's response in Genesis chapter 3, around verse 2, I think? Not supposed to eat or touch. God never said anything about touching, but that was their guardrail. I believe that was their guardrail. I believe the policy was, hey, let's not even get close to it. If we're not supposed to eat this, we'll just not even touch the tree so we're not tempted to eat it, and therefore we'll never break the rule. That's a guardrail. Another one is actually in Ephesians chapter 4. Where is it in my notes? Where Paul reminded his readers of the expectation that Christians remain sinless even when they are angry. Be angry and do not sin. And in the very next verse, he says, do not let the sun go down on your wrath. I think he's giving a guardrail. You know, a good way not to sin in anger is to not let the anger be unresolved before the day ends. Now, there's a lot of us who are married in here. How many of us, if that is a biblical sin principle, that if you let the sun go down on your wrath, you have sinned, how many of us are guilty of sin as married individuals or married couples? There's been plenty of times, and listen, a bunch of y'all just lied, so you're guilty of sin. There's a bunch of times you encounter in marital relationships where the end of the day comes and you haven't resolved things. You're still angry with each other. Sometimes it's needed. Sometimes you need that good night's sleep to be able to have the right conversation the next day. I think what Paul is talking about is what we would consider to be a guardrail. It may be a good practice to deal with it before you go to bed. Now, hopefully that gives you an idea of what we're talking about with guardrails. And I want to share with you some that I believe are good financial guardrails to help with this ethic, because I do think financial ethics might experience a little bit more gray area at times than other ethical arenas. When it comes to life and death ethics, like that one was pretty easy for us to walk through. We feel pretty good about abortion and euthanasia and capital punishment and all these things where they fit. Sometimes financial ethics in the arena of debt, maybe even in the arena of gambling and investing, might feel like they have a little bit more gray area. And so that's why I want to give guardrails. But before I do, I'll let Billy jump in real quick. In that picture. Well, technically not. The white line is too far. And guardrails are never set on the road. There's always a little space between where you're supposed to be and where the guardrail is. Yeah. The guardrail is supposed to be the alert system. All right. So here's some guardrails. They may not be applicable for your life situation, but these are ones I've come up with over the years. Also note that a guardrail is not where, it's not, as Billy was kind of pointing out, it's not where sin happens. It's preventing you from getting to the sin point. So what I'm going to talk about is not sin in and of itself, but it's that guardrail that's protecting you from getting to the point where you're encountering financial sin. And we're going to term it in this way. Your conscience should be pricked if this happens. I think here's a good one. Your conscience should be pricked if you are making a purchase for the sole purpose of upgrading a usable product you already have. We live in a world now where technology jumps so quickly. Every year, a new iPhone comes out. When they first started, it wasn't every year, but it quickly became every year. And now there are many people who feel like they have to upgrade to the next model every time that model comes out. One thing that in the area of contentment, because remember, that's one of the biblical foundations of financial stewardship, we don't need to upgrade everything every time. There are a lot of things that are usable that just because it's not the newest doesn't mean we need to get rid of it. I think to check yourself on contentment, a good principle is for your conscience to be pricked anytime you make a purchase for the sole purpose of upgrading something that's still usable. Not usable, totally understandable. But if it's still usable, maybe you check yourself to make sure this isn't a greed thing or a discontentment thing. Your conscience should be pricked if you are incurring a new debt. We've been talking about debt tonight. Not all debt is wrong, but anytime you are incurring a debt, starting a new debt, you need to examine what's the reason, what's the purpose. Is it simply because I want to be able to purchase this new great item, or is it because there is a long-term investment scenario here in plan? Am I getting a student loan so I can get the education to have the career that I'm pursuing? Or am I getting a new $20,000 credit card just so I can go out and have advance money that I'm going to have trouble paying down the road? There could be various reasons for incurring debt. Anytime you do incur debt, it should prick your conscience just a little bit so that you really consider why you're doing it. Your conscience should be pricked if you never feel a little guilt when you turn down someone's request for financial assistance. I got to admit, this was hard for me. When you're walking out of the grocery store and somebody approaches you and says, "Hey, can I have a couple bucks?" I'm not saying you should give them the money, but I'm saying you should feel a little moment where you question whether or not you should. If you get to the point where you refuse to ever consider giving money to somebody, you might be hard-hearted towards the benevolent concept that Scripture promotes. And so you should have your conscience pricked just when somebody requests for help, whether that be a stranger or whether that be a good friend or a relative. At least you should feel like, hey, I should at least think about this. Because if you're not willing to even think about it, you may have crossed into this hard-heartedness that refuses to be generous. Your conscience should be pricked if you refuse to part with a material object that you no longer use. There is another side to financial stewardship, and that is not hoarding things. Because hoarding is a form of greed. And if you have something that you never use, but you keep holding on to it, there might be an issue there as well. This is kind of the opposite of everything else we've been talking about, but this is something to consider as well. And I'm as guilty about this as anybody. Oh, I'll use that one day. That shirt there, I was able to wear it 5 years ago. I'm going to lose weight and get back into that shirt. No, I'm not. Not in enough time for it to still be fashionable in my eyes. So the reason this matters is because you could be giving that to someone who needs it, or you could be consigning it and getting a little bit of money back for good financial stewardship. And your conscience should be pricked if you do not first determine how much you will give to God when you are planning your budget. First fruits mentality undergirds the whole idea of financial stewardship. And so whenever you sit down to work on your budget, to plan out how your money is going to be spent, whether that's you do that every week, every month, every year, every 10 years, I don't care, God should get first priority. You should be thinking, how much can I give to the Lord? How much am I going to set aside for the Lord before you start thinking about all the bills? I know that can be uncomfortable, but that's how you ensure God gets financial priority, which Scripture tells us He's supposed to have. And along those lines, this is one that I challenge myself with. Your conscience should be pricked if you find yourself giving less than 10% of your total income to the kingdom of God. Reason I say this, New Testament nowhere specifies how much we need to give God, but if you go to Mosaic law, their bare minimum was 10%. And my thinking is this: Oftentimes people struggle with how much should I give God? Well, I know in part of the Bible there was a bare minimum of 10%. Why don't I start there? And if my giving falls below that, my conscience should be pricked. Now, let's admit something. There might be times you lose a job. You go through a financial crisis. Some of those things happen, and maybe you can't hit that minimum. But in general, if you set a standard of, I'm not going to drop below this, you're never going to feel guilty about giving to God. And when you do have to drop below it because of circumstances, it should bother you until you're able to get it back to where it should be. You should work to achieve that. That's my concept. Again, these are ones I came up with. They may not work for you. I have no problem with that. They're guardrails. They're not biblical principles. But maybe if we start setting some financial guardrails in our lives, whether they're like these or there's some you come up with on your own, we won't find ourselves falling into those gray areas ethically because we've set a guardrail up to keep us out of the gray areas. That's the concept here. So I think financial ethics, even though it might be lower on the pyramid of what gets the most attention, I mean things like abortion and homosexuality and divorce, those get the most attention from us from an ethical study standpoint. But financial ethics needs to be in the equation and in the conversation, because we have to give an account of how we've stewarded what God's given to us. So tonight I share with you some ideas to help you make wise financial decisions, because that is an ethic we have to be concerned about as well. That concludes everything I wanted to cover tonight. We've got a couple minutes left. Do you have any additional questions? Well, Stan Burnett shot up fast. Stan, what you got? Yeah. 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 But that's why we can't look for direct instruction from the Mosaic Law, but we can try to find basic financial principles that we can make application with. And that's the best we can do, really. Rich. Correct. Very true. DJ. Basically, what you're saying is when it comes to finances, it needs to be more about logic than it is about emotions. Because as a salesperson, you know how to play on somebody's emotions, not so much their logic. Well, you probably could figure out the logic too. You're a good salesperson. All right, thank you for your time and participation. Don't forget, next week we start the summer series. Hope you have a blessed week.